好，差不多了。你们有看到一些这个介绍的资讯嘛，对不对？讲者是从英国的 Newcastle 大学的建筑系来的导师，那他的比较专注在用所谓装置大会讲 restoration 这个事情在建筑上面去整合一些事情。那今天大概会说比较多他的教学研究，然后也我特别请他说了一些他们在他们的建筑系他们怎么上这节课I just done a little introduction to you in Chinese. All right. Okay. Let's welcome Martin.
Do I need to use?
Yeah. It'll be much.
Yes. Yeah, sure. Is that okay?
Yeah, because we have like recording, so it takes the sound would be much better.
Okay. Hi everyone. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you. So I'm really happy and excited to be here with you today. My name is Matthew Ozga-Lawn. The Ozga bit, by the way, is not English. That's a Polish connection.
Okay.
So that's why I have a funny, strange-sounding name. I'm afraid, even though I've been visiting Taiwan for, I think, almost 10 years, I'm very sorry that my Chinese is very bad, so I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying it. So I'm afraid it'll be English today. But I hope that you can enjoy some of the presentation and images that I want to show you from my work and my university's work. I named this talk Installation as Architectural Encounter. My practice, which is sometimes on my own, sometimes with a partner, and often with students, is we often try and collectively make installations, physical installations of work. And I want to kind of explain a little bit why we do this, and maybe an alternative way of thinking about the installation or exhibition. And then to kind of show you many examples that I hope that you'll enjoy of some of my practice and my teaching. So just to kind of locate myself a little bit, because I think most of you will be like, where is Newcastle? And I think that's a fair enough question. We are located on the northeast of England. It's a small, what we call a post-industrial city in England. It's on the only good train route in the UK. So I was just thinking of Tien's study of the HSR in Taiwan. This is not as fast as HSR. It's not very fast, but it's the fastest one in the UK. And it goes between London and Edinburgh. So in Newcastle, we have quite a good connection to two nice, very interesting cities, Edinburgh, capital of Scotland, and London. And Newcastle, of course, is a interesting industrial city itself. This is our campus at Newcastle. I have an office here. It makes it look important from the outside, but it's a tiny office on the inside. And I think it's quite funny because the building looks quite, like Harry Potter, Hogwarts, But actually on the inside, it's like a 1970s concrete conversion. So it's like a facade with a very basic interior. But the spaces are quite well used. And one of the things that I think is quite good about Newcastle, about the school, and maybe about the UK architecture research more generally, is that there's a very strong emphasis on what we term in the UK design research, or research by design, research through design. In Newcastle, we call it research in creative practice. So it means that I think research can take many different forms, as we, I think, all recognize in architecture. But as a department, we're able to produce research through design in the form of drawings, installation, and so on, that can then be submitted to our various research frameworks. So along with written research, it can be kind of design research as well. And that means that we're not seen as like, I guess me and the other design researchers in the university or in the school, we're not seen as like a lower second tier research. It's kind of on the same level as written research. I think that's really important. And we have quite an arts-based approach because we're next door to a fine art department. So all of these projects are very kind of, they have as their focus representation, drawing, modeling, installation, and so on, collage. And this research kind of finds its way into various publications. These are a few of recent books from the department. One of the nicest, I think, in terms of summarizing a lot of this creative practice work is the last one, Creative Practice Inquiry in Architecture by two of my colleagues, edited by two of my colleagues. I'll be talking a little bit about a chapter that I provided for this second book, Embodied Awareness of Space, which I think is out in English next month. And in it I kind of talk about installation. And what I like about creative practice research is that this is one project that we worked on titled Everest Death Zone. I'll talk about it in a little bit. But it makes its way into kind of academic journals, like the one on the left, but also into kind of non-academic things, like this is AD magazine, which is quite a nice magazine, yeah. Sort of more practice-oriented or public-facing. And then what I really wanted to share, and always enjoy sharing and looking at when I visit other institutions, especially in other countries, is just teaching, how we can teach and share ideas around pedagogy. So on the left is a very early project by me and James, who we have this collaborative practice we call Stasis. And on the right is an image from some of our students in the Masters of Architecture program. So you can see, in this case, there's quite a close relationship. It's not always the way. We don't force them to do what we like. But we do suggest, I suppose, ways of working, particularly with the idea of an installation. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about a little bit today. So just to briefly introduce installation, I'll go through this quite quickly, and I just wanted to, I suppose, I'm just really thinking about Tien's exhibition, which is in my head now, with this wonderful collection of different representational modes, including some work I noticed by Ozga-Lawn, who are the producers of this exhibition, Parasite. It was produced in New York in the late 1970s. I think Ozga-Lawn and some of their contemporaries were really the forum. They were the first architects, I think, to use installation in this really interesting dynamic way, as a way of kind of expressing the full project rather than as a sort of reduction of the project. And I guess I wanted to just think about the relationship of installation in architecture, as architects understand it, compared to how artists use and understand installation. So we kind of know from the 20th century that installation has become, I guess, the main form of artistic output. I think it's almost like the default, in some ways, the default mode for an artist, a fine artist, especially working today, might be to consider how their work would be represented through installation. I mean, in a lot of cases anyway. This is Oliver Eliasson's kind of famous installation in the Tate Modern in London, where he created this sort of artificial sun. And I think one of the things that's been suggested about this, which was nicely summarized by an author called Claire Bishop, was that it kind of foregrounds the embodied experience of the space. So instead of representing texture and light and space and so on, installation art presents these elements directly for us to experience as humans, as artists. So the artwork is effectively completed by the people sort of sunbathing in the artificial sun. And this, I guess, is generated, initially through the ideas, especially of Marcel Duchamp in the early 20th century, where these kind of ready-made sculptures that I'm sure you'll have seen before started to, I think, really to impact upon and shift the emphasis of the arts. As he says, I was very interested in ideas, not merely in visual products. I think this kind of transition, effectively, in the arts has fundamentally altered them, expanding the possibilities of our engagement and encounter with art objects. And you may have come across this diagram before by the author Rosalind Krauss in the 1970s, where she was, it's termed an axiomatic diagram in the sense that it's trying to define different axioms and axiomatic structures, because for her, the category of what was termed sculpture had become so vast that it sort of incorporated everything in a sense. So here the essay, which is a wonderful essay called Sculpture in the Expanded Field, tries to, I suppose, define some limits on what you might call sculpture, what you can call landscape, what you call architecture, what she terms not architecture. And I think it's a very interesting attempt at creating some definitions in this very quite nebulous landscape. She uses this American artist, Mary Miss, as an example, with the focus of the experience of the body moving through landscape. So she writes, over the last 10 years, rather surprising things have come to be called sculpture. Narrow corridors with TV monitors at the end, large photographs documenting country heights, mirrors placed at strange angles in ordinary rooms, temporary lines cut into the floor of the desert. Nothing, it would seem, could possibly give to such a motley of effort the right to lay claim to whatever one might mean by the category of sculpture, unless, that is, the category can be made to become almost infinitely malleable. So I think this is really interesting, and just a sort of a starting point for a conversation about installation, basically. This is, I guess, an example of an architectural installation, or what we might consider it to be one. It's a serpentine. It's one of the serpentine pavilion entries from 2021. The architects were called Counterspace Studio. I don't know if anyone's seen this one before. I quite like it because it looks a little bit like a SketchUp model, that's just planted on reality. But I think this tends to be how we think about installation in relation to architecture. I think it's more like a pavilion scale, like a small scale architecture. And they're generally kind of temporary structures, like the Serpentine Pavilion is a temporary, every year there's a competition. So in a sense, they're quite similar to conventional architecture projects. They're just at a smaller scale. They follow a linear process of development through drawing and so on, and end up in realization with a budget and contractors. And of course, there are many, many wonderful examples of pavilion architecture. In fact, I was touring some pavilion architecture bamboo structures today. So this is a one way of, I guess, thinking about installation in relation to architecture, the architecture of the pavilion. The type of installation that I'm really wanting to talk about today, though, I think is more about a collection. Maybe it's a little bit more like an exhibition in some sense, or a spatialization of images. So it's maybe, when I use the term encounter, architectural encounter, I think about it in a slightly difficult way, in the sense that we are meeting lots of different types of images and models. A kind of point in which we have to interpret space, interpret the ideas of space when we see them, and this can contain many varied types of kind of architectural image. And I'm just illustrating this with two works by the constructivist architect Alan Lazitsky from the 1920s. He had a series of paintings called the Pro-Un Room. You might have come across again. I feel like this image looks like a very early version of SketchUp. I don't know, maybe that's just me. But it kind of has this amazing quality to it. He described them as the train station where art arrives and architecture departs. So it's already like a transitional type of painting, I think. But then later he made what he called the Pro-Un room, which is on the right, which is an attempt at spatializing these kind of paintings. So by moving around the room, you get a different experience of it. You configure the painting, if you like, yourself. One of the key theorists that I use to kind of help me think about this is Robin Evans, the kind of British architecture theorist and historian who wrote so wonderfully and so much about architectural drawing. He has this famous set of essays, translations from drawing to building, which are very useful. But in his last book, which he was writing when he died, he had this diagram at the end of it called the arrested image. And I find this diagram to be just hugely interesting and useful. So you have these different categories of architectural representation. You have orthographic drawings like section, plan, and so on. Perspectival representations, which might be a drawing, but could also be a photograph. The designed object in the middle. That could be a model, it could also be a building. And then you have this really weird thing, which is the observer, the imagination, and the kind of perception, visual perception. So there's lots of kind of elements of this diagram interrelating. And one of the nice things about it is that all of the lines that connect everything, they don't have arrows, so they can kind of go both ways. And that kind of makes you think about it in all sorts of interesting ways. So line number 3, for example, from orthographic projection to designed object, maybe that's a conventional way of working from a plan and section into a building, or kind of schematic drawings into a building. Whereas number 5, from the object to the perspective, that could be like a photograph of a building. But then you can start to kind of flip them around and think about the strange things that might happen. For example, well, I suppose if you followed 3 backwards, it would be like a survey of an existing building. You could kind of make 3-dimensional constructions starting with a perspective using kind of techniques of perspective construction. But then it gets really weird if you start involving the observer. It gets into, I think, territory of psychoanalysis, strange things like, does the building see you when you see the building, and so on. Robin Evans wrote about this in his notes on the diagram. He says, what connects thinking to imagination, imagination to drawing, drawing to building, and buildings to our eyes is projection in one guise or another, or processes that we have chosen to model on projection. And he says all are zones of instability. And he says this instability is why it's underrepresented in theory. Either projection is acceptable because it's transparent, or it passes between the creative imagination and the item created like a dark cloud. I really like this dark cloud term. It makes it seem like every drawing that we produce in architecture has this possibility for imaginative reconfiguring. So all of these types of spaces that he's mapping, some are real, some are imaginary, but they all get kind of flattened into the diagram and treated in the same way, and I think that's very interesting as well. This, for me, is like the basis of what an architectural installation can be, because it's about bringing all of these different ways of seeing architecture and visualizing it together. So there are other academics looking at this installation as a kind of mode for representation. This is a work by Penelope Haralambadu at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL in London. She's also looking at one of Duchamp's kind of famous artworks here, the artwork Given, which is set up as an installation, but it's also kind of like a painting. So she unpacks some of the visual lines, especially this idea with this picture that it's a kind of stereoscopic. There are two visual points. And she has this very nice term, I think, for how we read architectural images, where she says there's a suspension of desire. In architecture, the object referred to by the drawing is delayed, the pleasure derives from the combination of information from several different drawings, for example, the plan in relation to the section, leading to a slow blossoming of the design structure in the mind. Architecture design, therefore, involves a suspension of pleasure that produces desire. I think all of these kind of conditions, this dark cloud, the idea of a kind of suspension and desire, they're all really fascinating ways of trying to break apart the conventions of architecture drawing, which are quite closed in a lot of ways. So that's the kind of theoretical intro. And that's sort of the basis for a lot of the projects that I do. And I just wanted to kind of talk you through some of the projects now and some of the student work as well. This is the first project titled Animate Landscapes. In this project, me and my colleague James were trying to work with furniture objects to create a kind of embodied relationship with the site that we were working on, which was a site in Warsaw in Poland. So we were kind of configuring and rearranging these physical pieces of furniture, but rather than just using them as the surfaces for different mappings and so on of the site, they became kind of embedded in the way that we were representing the site. So this sort of configuration of bed frame and tables and chairs and other objects became sort of embedded and effectively became the proposal for the landscape of the site. This kind of train station configuration was originally, for example, the bed frame. So they get sort of enmeshed with the way that we're walking and our embodied kind of interaction with these objects on the site. And we ended up realizing the installation at a kind of as a sort of one-to-one space where you could walk around and view and experience the project directly. And we're lucky, I suppose, that we entered this project into the competition for the Pamphlet Architecture series, which you might have come across, which are just a wonderful series of books. They still have competitions, so keep an eye out. Do try and enter it. It was set up by Stephen Hall in the early 80s, I think, and has had all sorts of quite nice contributors to it. And the focus of the competition in the year that we won it was resilience. And so for us, it was not so much about a kind of idea of. So the resilience came from the idea of these objects, that they somehow resisted transformation, and they would be embedded within all of the different art pieces of representation that we made. So the second project I mentioned earlier was titled Everest Death Zone, and it was made, again, through a combination of drawing and installation. The site for this project was the territory on Mount Everest, which is above a certain point where you can't survive unassisted by oxygen. And so it has this title, the Death Zone. And one of the features, I suppose, of this landscape is that there are lots of frozen bodies of hikers who didn't manage to ascend or descend the summit. And those bodies become too hazardous to remove because they're usually off the trail. So they just kind of stay there, and because it's a frozen condition, they effectively become permanent markers on the landscape, and often, in a weird way, become sort of signposting, in a sense, for other hikers. And we were interested in this first attempt by a British explorer called Benjamin Mallory, and he and a team attempted to summit the mountain in the 1920s. And it's very ambiguous as to whether he made it or not. He definitely didn't survive, but it's ambiguous as to whether he made it to the summit or not. And there's only evidence from certain video reconstructions and a kind of team, a camera team. But you can imagine a 1920s camera it maybe weighed a lot. It was huge. They couldn't take it up the mountain that far. So these three images are the last kind of recorded pictures of Mallory and his colleague Irvine ascending. We were interested in the project about this kind of impossibility of architecture drawing to capture certain scales of landscape and how we have to reconfigure our imagination in different ways to accommodate that. We ended up installing the project in quite a nice space in Newcastle. There's a famous bridge in Newcastle, the Tyne Bridge, which is like the same architects as the Sydney Bridge. This big kind of like a sort of semicircular structure, and it has these empty towers. So we kind of used the verticality of one of the towers to represent, I suppose, this kind of sense of danger or space, and constructed an installation out of mountaineering equipment, carabiners and mountain ropes and so on. And then we played some of the original footage of the climb onto the installation. We also mapped and modeled the thing for a VR, virtual reality kind of exploration of the space as well. We were kind of curious about whether there could be some conversation, I suppose, between the physical installation and the virtual reality model. So for my own PhD research at Newcastle, I was looking at a little theatre in Italy. There are some very famous theatres by Palladio and others in Vincenzo and other cities, and this is a very small one by an architect called Vincenzo Scamozzi, who was one of Palladio's students. And I was interested in this theatre because it's kind of like a theatre for one person. There was this duke in a town called Sapienetta. The duke created his ideal city. It has a theatre and a palace and a square and so on. But basically, it's like a little performative town, that was just for him. And he has this theatre in the middle of it, where the stage set is a perspectival stage, but it only really works if you're in that central location. So he has an audience maybe of other sort of nobles and so on, officials. But he's part of this kind of Gonzaga family, and it's really just a space designed around him. And I wanted to use it as a kind of metaphor or relationship between how the architect studio works, how we project our imagination onto the world and kind of operate on the world through these spaces. So like I said, I have a very thin and narrow office in Newcastle. So it was kind of like a perfect space to try and translate this thin and narrow theatre. It translated down at a scale of kind of 1 to 5 generally. But then I kind of rearranged it and reconfigured it and set it up in this sort of perspectival arrangement. So there's like a 1 to 20 model of the dais that the Duke sat on, and a 1 to 5 model of the stage. And I was kind of curious. It was quite difficult to work on because obviously it was my office, so I had to work somewhere else. But it was also, as a student or someone just passing by in the corridor, you can kind of peep in and see what's going on. And actually, I completed this and finished it just before the COVID-19 pandemic. So it was frozen like this for two years, basically, just uninhabited. It was a long lockdown in the UK. So that's when I came back to it, almost 2 years later, it was quite bizarre. But the attempt is by kind of configuring an architectural project around one perspectival point of view, it creates a sort of relationship between things at different scales that I was kind of interested in exploring and unpacking. Okay, so just to move on to some examples from my teaching. This is mostly teaching from the Master of Architecture program at Newcastle. And we also, as I mentioned, we encourage the students to work towards an installation. So they have 2 years in the degree, and the first year is quite technical. There's a lot of structure, there's a lot of this kind of thing. And then in the second year, there's quite a lot of space for them to explore a design thesis and that can take on many, many different forms. So for the students in mine and James's studio especially, we like to kind of get them to work in installation. This is a project by a student called Alicia Birkin, and she was looking at an individual and creating what she was terming an architectural biography of this individual, whose name's T.E. Lawrence. T. Lawrence is one of these kind of British colonial figures who went to the Middle East and probably did all sorts of damage. But he is quite an interesting character because he was very conflicted in a sense about his colonial involvement, and then he retired to this tiny little cottage in England in a county called Dorset. And he wrote this biography called The Seven Pillars of Wisdom. This cottage has 7 little windows, and so the student Alicia was kind of imagining that his experiences in the desert would kind of be reconfigured into the cottage through this biography. And we actually got some funding to take her little installation to his very unusual cottage, and sort of have it in this what's called it's a national trust site. So there's lots of people coming in to visit, and they could see this kind of weird facsimile of the house. This second student, Harrison Avery, was looking at a site in Northern Ireland, a very complicated political site, the Maze Long Kesh prison. If anyone knows the Steve McQueen film Hunger, there's a film about this imprisoned Republican member of Parliament who went on a hunger strike, and it's a pretty hard film to watch, very difficult film to watch. But this prison is a very politically contested and uncomfortable site for both Northern Irish and Irish people. So Harrison's project tried to use installation and especially ideas around perspective to create ways of thinking about the site that don't just offer one solution. I think there was some attempt at trying to develop the site, but no one can agree on what to do with it. So Harrison's project uses these kind of big, complex kind of perspectival installation pieces to kind of almost give you multiple different views on the site and overlay them in different ways. And again, this happened, he was working on this project in the middle of as the pandemic started. In the UK, the response was only in March 2020, and so all the students in that year had to suddenly take everything out of the studio because they were told to go home immediately. And for an installation-based studio, this is a challenge, a difficulty. But Harrison managed somehow to get all of his installation components into his little student flat in Newcastle. And then he kind of became imprisoned by his own project in quite an unusual way, but one that was quite productive in some sense. The house ended up getting mapped into some of his drawings. I think this is a final project, by Mark Laverty and Alec McCullough. And this project was entirely undertaken in lockdown condition, effectively. So they started their academic year with, they lived in Newcastle, but they couldn't really attend the studio or campus. They had to stay in their home. So we did everything on Zoom, everything remotely. And they did this kind of forensic study of their house that they shared. This kind of little Victorian English terrace house, and it became a kind of what we might term like a hauntological study, using kind of a sense of like the different layers of the history of the building, how they might appear as kind of ghosts or apparitions within the study. And they were using a lot of these kind of rudimentary LiDAR scanning and so on with smartphones. This is a sort of section of some of the living spaces. What became quite nice is that those scanning technologies were very glitchy and created all sorts of problems. They're not very accurate scanning devices at all. So they started to model and make the glitches and the errors, and kind of using wire mesh and other kind of techniques, they started to kind of reconfigure their house. I think they were living with some non-architecture students as well, who just had to put up with this. And the project became quite nice because it became about this kind of conversation about how ideas are worked with, especially in collaboration. So there's two students working. And this was a device, for example, where the student in the upstairs bedroom would pass a drawing to the student in the downstairs bedroom through this very complex kind of drawing machine, so that the student in the lower bedroom could kind of work on it and reconfigure it. I think, it was quite a pleasure in a sense. I never got to see any of these things really in person because of this lockdown condition. So the final exam was this quite complex Zoom exam, but they hijacked the Zoom call. So at some point, without letting us know, they went from a live conversation to like a pre-recorded ontological film, and it became really uncanny. We were trying to talk to them, but they just started not responding, and then it glitched into all of these kind of different things. It was a really wonderful piece of work. They entered this project into the pamphlet architecture series and they came second, which was wonderful, but unfortunately it didn't kind of net them a book. So that's mostly projects from the MArch. I wanted to kind of finish just by mentioning the course that I'm currently director of at Newcastle, which is Advanced Architecture Design, or AAD. And this is just in case anyone feels like they might want to take up some postgraduate study in the UK and work on kind of installation and things like this. These are some kind of recent drawings. We have quite a nice and international cohort. Students from Korea, Japan, China, India, Taiwan, and our focus recently hasn't so much been on installation as the subject, but we kind of still explore through varied techniques kind of representational questions around drawing, around the kind of modalities of drawing, and we think anyway that it's one of the more explorative, experimental master's programs in the UK. So that's it. Thank you very much for taking a look at my work. If you did want to see anything else, the QR code is an IG account of recent drawings and things. I don't update it as much as I should, but it is there if you want to see it. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I realized the microphone was off now. was it? Okay.
Yeah.
We're going to open to questions.
Yeah, please, if anyone has any questions, feel free.
Basically, I have a lot of curiosity and interest rather than question. Because Matt, your teaching and other projects are quite, I would say, compared to so-called traditional architecture school, they're more focusing on traditional architectural education or the foundation or the training aimed to be a practice architect. And in terms of art, although art is very important to architecture because it sits between art and engineering, right? Architecture is quite important. But in terms of the training itself, I think that the artistic training is more about a way of thinking and how you creatively making a spatial arrangement and putting more like a meaning, putting more spiritual, emotional, all these things, rather than like all these rational arrangement of functions, all of things.
Yeah.
But but this is actually, although for like more mature architect, they might handling these things quite well. But compared to the population of the professional, like those who can manage arts and engineering, like very well, is quite minority in the architecture society.
Yeah.
So during the training, because I heard many faculties are quite focusing, I would say, like emphasizing the importance of the foundation of architecture, all these like rational thinking. So I just curious, for those like students get into the architecture school, they are facing so many things that have to learn this and that. From art to engineering, it's like they've been exposed to a diverse subject. So during this training, how do you find, or what do you find that in terms of curriculum, in terms of the way how to inspire students or guiding them to navigate through the trouble landscape of all these things? And what is your expectation? What is there like methodology or your way of guidance during all this? Because you're going to face so many different kinds of students, right? So I just basically it's more about curious how the situation is in Newcastle.
Yeah, sure. No, it's really. Shall I use this?
Yeah. You're pretty.
It's really interesting question and observation, and I think everywhere, if this is happening a lot in the UK, but everywhere is kind of in the process of recalibrating architectural education at the moment, I think. So the model that I've just shown you is the existing model, but it's going to change quite soon. The RIBA, the British professional body, are changing it from what is currently 2 degrees to 1 integrated degree. And that integrated degree will be shorter, so 5 years, including 1 year in practice, so 4 teaching years, effectively. Not much space to do so much stuff like this, when, as you say, there's so much material already to be covered. And in fact, we're under pressure to cover various aspects in much more detail.
That's a reality.
Well, for example, fire safety is an important thing in the UK at the moment because of the Grenfell fire disaster. So there's that whole aspect of it, but at the moment in this model, the installation work is in the very final year of the degree. So they've done quite a lot of technical thinking and so on. And what we hope would happen, and maybe I didn't emphasize it so much in this presentation, would there'd be some kind of integration of those ideas into their final thesis. But it's effectively, when they're in this final year, they choose a studio, which is a research-led studio. And so the research in our studio would be about representation, fundamentally, like about the kind of challenging and working with qualities of architectural drawing and trying to unpack them. But then there'll be another studio which is on like biomaterial or something, which is about growing building, or there'll be another studio which is more like maybe more conventional, I suppose, in different ways. But the key for us is that each of the studios is informed by a very specific strand of research. And I think what is important at Newcastle, and I hope will be maintained when the degree changes, because I think it is a challenge, is that we are trying to encourage students to be specialists rather than generalists. So if we can try and get a student to become a specialist in a subject before they graduate, we feel like that kind of gives them an advantage in some sense in the difficult and competitive job market. But I think also architects, as you say, there's too much to learn in a short space of time, and the reality is architects are learning for their whole lives. So it's almost like if we can just encourage that specialism at an early stage, maybe we can kind of be productive in that sense. I guess the second part of it is that we also understand that a lot of our graduates don't go on to become architects. So I think it's out of the undergraduate degree, which has 150 students in every year, we know that after 3 years, 50% of them don't go into architecture. They go into different fields. Maybe it's film or something else. On the master's program, it's obviously more focused towards architecture because you made that commitment. But I think it's good to acknowledge that architecture education has a wider role in the arts,
Sure.
and even in the industry, wider industry. So there's lots of challenges going on. I think the most interesting pedagogical challenge that you mentioned, that you're asking about, is this master's program, the Advanced Architectural Design Masters, because this is only a 1-year program. Well, there is a 2-year option, but the 1-year program is much more popular. And in that situation, you're starting with like a ground zero, effectively, fresh start. So what we do is, because it runs from September to August, we work the students up to a kind of exhibition of work, and then we keep that work in place so that incoming students can kind of see the exhibition.
Oh, I see.
And say, like, this is the end point.
Okay.
So don't be too surprised when we ask you to do some crazy experiments and drawings. And we hope that, effectively, in the AAD program, we do very focused urban analytical studies, but we just ask them to pay real attention to the kind of drawings that they make, effectively. So recently, we've been looking at Newcastle and the wider region. It might just be that we kind of suggest to a student a certain artist or artwork or way of working to work in. And because we have quite long projects, the students can work from two, maybe even a bit more than 2 semesters on one project. It gives them quite a lot of time to experiment and get confident of the subject. So hopefully that's a good model. I'm not sure if it works everywhere. I mean, we kind of have some success with it, but it's always changing. The landscape of architecture education, I think, is always changing. So,
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. Personally, I quite appreciate that because I feel that basically my background was not from architectural and from mathematics.
Okay.
And then went through like visual communication, computer-aided design, but end up in architecture. It's become like more about my interest of being a supporting role in this industry in terms of digital media. But I appreciate the whole industry that you basically you bring idea into realization. I think that's I would say that's the magic aspect of this profession. So I also found that in university education, usually we are actually fighting with the government or the RIBA system because we are standing in the realm of idealization and bring all the dream and all these hope, all these things to the human being. But on the other side, they are maintaining the profession on the foundation, safety, everything of this profession. So I wouldn't say it's a conflict role, but usually we are looking at different things and thinking different ways. There's tension about it. So I would say probably to maintain the tension, probably this is always our mission. Is that we cannot simply just we just 100% agree with you, so I will just go forward with that. So it basically becoming like a professional training school. It's quite sad about
that. Exactly. I think we have
totally
to avoid that.
Totally appreciate what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Thanks.
Maybe.
Yeah, one thing that I didn't mention to you, as a matter of fact, students here, the MF1 students here, they were also asked to do installation tests during their first year study.
Oh, great.
As a part of the training. So maybe they have some questions too. Also, Tim would like to show you something from the design studios. Well, perhaps later.
Yeah.
Interestingly, we have our first years, like the MARC 1 students from non-architectural backgrounds. In the first
Yeah,
year
yeah,
into architectural learning is a 3.5 year program. So the first semester they do installation, working with objects, working with materials.
yeah.
And then in your case, you're showing us works from like rather advanced, sophisticated like student projects. So I think it's an interesting contrast between these two, and to see how this idea of installations in teaching can work at different levels, at least I think.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I guess, the AAD work here is a bit of a mix of, some of these are final images, but I guess these kind of projects were much earlier on in the sense of just inviting a student who's just joined Newcastle to make something that they're interested in and trying to encourage them. But they obviously did come with an architectural background, so it's not quite comparable. But you can see that we still try and we still try and start them like quickly, just investigating representation, I suppose. And so on. Great.
Time for that.
Yeah, sure. Okay,
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.